Welcome to Smart in the City, the Bible podcast where we bring together top actors in the smart city arena, sparking dialogues and interactions around the stakeholders and themes most prevalent for today's citizens and tomorrow's generations. I am your host, Tamlin Shimizu, and I hope that you will enjoy this episode and gain knowledge and connections to drive the change for a better urban life. Smart in the City is brought to you by Bible Smart Cities. We enable processes from research and strategy development to co-creation and implementation. To learn more about us, please visit the Bible platform at bible-smartcities.eu. So today we are recording live at the Autonomy Mobility World Expo in Paris. So there's many activities going on right now. There's the Startup Village, City Hub, 2 conference programs, test tracks, demos, B2B, B2G meetings, Startup Challenge, Innovation Awards ceremony. I think I could continue to go on, but our next guest can let you know about that and about many other activities going on. So sitting with me is none other than Ross Douglas. He is the founder and CEO of Autonomy Paris, basically the mastermind behind all of this that's going on right here, I would say. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tamlin.
So I really want to dig into your vision behind everything, and also a lot of lessons that you've learned through putting on these events. But first, before we dig into a little bit more of the concrete questions, I always like to start off with a little bit of a teaser to get the ball rolling. So if you were to ride in any mode of transport in the future, for example, like flying cars or whatever it might be, which mode of transport would it be?
I've never thought of that. At the moment, I'd really like to try a robotaxi. I've just started reading quite a few reports of people who've been trying robotaxis in China and America, and they've been really favorable. So if I had the choice now, I'd like to see what it's like in the back of a robotaxi.
Good answer. That would be fun. Mm-hmm. So, I want to dig in here. So what's the story behind Autonomy? Where did it all start?
So I started Autonomy 8 years ago. At the time, I was living in South Africa, and I had been reading about global warming for sort of 5 or 6 years. And what all the books were saying was that that we just continue to increase our carbon emissions, and this is going to start having quite dramatic climatic effects. And I thought at the time, this was now 2015, I thought at the time incorrectly that Europeans, and particularly people based in Paris, would move quite quickly and change their behavior, particularly with transport, because transport's one of the easier ways to reduce carbon emissions. Buildings are much more difficult, meat consumption is more difficult, but transport's one of the easier ways. So I moved to Paris and I started an event, Autonomy, the idea being autonomous or independent of owning motor cars. Obviously at that stage, there was only one EV manufacturer, which was Tesla. And the idea that you can move around in ways that are much more sustainable by getting rid of car ownership and going to more flexible car use when you need it, car sharing, and obviously use things like bicycle, public transport, etc. In that year, the biggest trend in mobility were people switching from normal cars to SUVs, which radically increased carbon emissions. So what I learned is consumers change really late, and they're not that easy to change.
So basically, this event has been going on for 8 years. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. Even maybe minus COVID, or did you do them online?
We did them digital during COVID.
Okay.
So this is the 7th edition, so we worked for a year before that. So we've been going for 8 years, correct?
Okay, perfect. And so what have you learned over the last 8 years?
What I've learned is that change is really driven by policymakers. It's not really driven by consumer behavior. I thought incorrectly 8 years ago that consumers would read newspapers, get alarmed by climate change, and start changing their behaviors radically. But really, what actually happens is lawmakers get together and say, "Look, we need to reduce carbon emissions." And like the EU's done, they ban the use of combustion vehicles, or like the Americans have done, they put a huge amount of money in the Inflation Reduction Act towards cleaner technology and innovation. So, the leaders in this space that brings about change, or the change makers, are actually the policy makers, not the consumers. So once policy is set, then companies start adapting to that policy by making electric vehicles or whatever the case may be to reduce their emissions, and then consumers adapt last of all.
So does that mean that that doesn't mean that there's no responsibility as a consumer, right? But do you, like, I guess this is kind of the debate sometimes is where do we place the responsibility? And with what you said, the responsibility mostly lies with policy.
Yeah, look, I think consumers have a responsibility, but consumers' biggest responsibility in a democratic society is to vote for responsible governments, because governments have the power to bring about massive change, or bring about change on sufficient scale that it has impact. I think it's wrong to say that it's up to consumers to change behavior. Otherwise, we will not get results, because that's just inaccurate. Statistically, it doesn't work like that. You as a consumer can do very little. What needs to happen is that you need to stop, for example, using fossil fuels. Well, you as a consumer, if there's not a government decision to ban fossil fuels or accelerate the adoptions of EVs, you just don't have a choice. So, not everything as a consumer. Consumers don't have that much power in the ability to change and reduce carbon emissions. Also, if you put that pressure on consumers, they end up getting extremely anxious because they are so disempowered. And the changes they make are really, just so incremental, it actually doesn't move the needle anything. So you need to have, democracy. You need to have responsible voters who vote in responsible governments who, are actively reducing the burning of fossil fuels. That's the first thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That perspective is always interesting for me to get from different people. So, what do you think are the current kind of mobility trends going on that you're seeing over these last 8 years?
I mean, there are probably three big mobility trends. The one is the move from combustion vehicles to electric vehicles, and that's now really accelerating. So, 8 years ago, there was lots of skepticism that Tesla would survive as a company, or, do EVs really work? But whereas now there's no longer that skepticism. VW, with the biggest car company in the world, has gone fully into electric vehicles. You see, particularly in Europe, the sales of EVs shooting right up, whereas the sales of combustion vehicles are coming right down. So, that transition is happening, and it's happening quite fast. So that's the first big trend is the move from combustion to electric. The second big trend, and the one that we are most interested in, is the move from motorist to mobilist. And what I mean by that is a motorist owns a motor car and has a pair of car keys, set of car keys to move from A to B. A mobilist has a smartphone and doesn't own a motor car, but will use any vehicle, whether it be bicycle, car, scooter, bus, train, robo-taxi, that makes sense for that journey or trip. And that's a much more sustainable way of moving, because what happens is that generally people buy a big car for the weekends or holidays or for status, and they use a big car to do short trips with one person weighing 80 kilograms, a car weighing more than 2 tons. So even with electric vehicles, they are more sustainable than combustion vehicles, but it's a completely unsustainable way of moving if you own an electric vehicle to commute every day. You have to try and find ways of not owning a big, heavy motor car, maybe owning a very light electric vehicle like a Biro or something, and then when you need a big family car, you rent it. So that is the second massive trend from motorist to mobilist. And then I think the third trend is the autonomous vehicles, which have been promised and delayed, but we're starting to see some movement in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. And what do you think about, you said how you started this journey was really focusing on, global greenhouse emissions. Where does your optimism lie right now? Like, do you think that there's still time to turn the tide? Or how are you seeing that?
I mean, this is slightly outside of our focus at Autonomy.
Yeah.
At Autonomy, our focus is on trying to get people to move about sustainably, and so the motivation being, how can we reduce our carbon emissions? To answer your question, the IPCC has just brought out its sixth report, and what is clear is that we've been unable to reduce our carbon emissions, and what is clear is that carbon emissions go up each year to, we now, I think, at 428 parts per million or something. I started Autonomy, we were at 400 parts per million. So as a society, we have been unable to date to reduce our carbon emissions. And the reason being is just that it's extremely difficult to do that, because you have to somehow stop the coal, oil, and gas companies from producing that. You have to stop economies from using those fossil fuels. They're extremely cheap, they're extremely efficient, they're extremely good at doing what they do. The only problem is that they produce carbon emissions that contributes to global warming. And then it gets more complicated than that because, we have now a lot of methane emissions, which are coming a lot from, the gas industry. And obviously we're reducing coal, but increasing gas, and methane leaks are another massive cause of climate change. And obviously methane comes from cattle too, and people don't want to change their diets. A couple of years ago, we were seeing this big trend in alternative meats, and those companies have pretty much crashed. People want to eat traditional burgers, not surprisingly. So I think we need to start having honest conversations about carbon emissions, as opposed to sort of dishonest conversations. Look, it's quite easy to do. We can change it, and we just need to do this. It's extremely hard to change human behavior. It's extremely hard to run economies on renewable energy, and it's extremely hard to reduce carbon emissions sufficiently to come within the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but I think if people underestimate the size of the challenge, they underestimate what's needed to be done to achieve it.
Yeah, I agree. And not to take a pessimistic view, but I think that we need to be realistic about where we actually are and where we need to go. Do you think events like this help? What is the main hope that people get out of this to meet a lot of these goals?
So if you look at, for example, combustion motor cars and that community and that ecosystem, it's been around for 100 years. And, all those relationships, the oil companies, the motor car companies, the tier one suppliers, they built up that ecosystem over years. And as a result, it's a very, very efficient industry. You can get into any combustion car, drive anywhere in the world and find petrol or diesel, get it serviced, get the lubricants. It all works because that community has spent years building up those ecosystems, that supplies chains, and it all works. Now you want to try and replace that with a more sustainable mobility ecosystem. Well, those ecosystems, those players need to get together and start building that ecosystem because it doesn't exist. So, if I, try rent an electric car and I want to drive it around, there'll be chargers that are available, but I won't be able to get power from those chargers because I'm not on that charge app, or, I have to download another charge app. So all of this community needs to come together and keep having discussions on how to build the ecosystems. And what you see at an event like Autonomy is you see that ecosystem being built with software and hardware companies talking together and saying, look, we've got the hardware, you've got the software. How do we work together to provide an alternative to car ownership for the commuter?
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think are the limitations, though, to events? Like, how much can events really do, and what's the limitation?
Yeah, events are just part of the mix. They in and of themselves, they're not the most important thing. You need, good entrepreneurs. You need lots of funding, and then you need events that can, bring buyers and sellers together and bring the network together. But if you don't have good entrepreneurs, it's hard. If you don't have good funding, it's hard. If you don't have good policies, it's hard. Europe's quite fortunate in that it has good entrepreneurs, lots of, very good universities. It has pretty good funding, not as much as America, but it has really good funding compared to South America or Africa. And it has pretty good policy. So, you see at events in Europe that, deals are being done. There's you look at an event like Autonomy, people are talking on the stands, they're interacting, they're communicating, they're networking, they're deal making. And what really is happening is that all these, like a spider's web, all these connections are being built. And these new ecosystems are being built to replace the old ones that are, very, very polluting.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. What do you think is maybe the most interesting project or innovation or thing along those lines that you've seen at Autonomy?
So what we're seeing from the policy side is that cities do not want more cars, and cities do not want lots of car ownership because it contributes just to pollution. Even if it's electric cars, it contributes to clean pollution to clean congestion as opposed to dirty congestion. So you've got this very strong political will from cities to get rid of car ownership. And the industry has to respond to that because car ownership is just going to become impossible in most cities. So, for example, Transport for London, who are here today, have communicated that by 2040, they want 80% of modal share to belong to walking, cycling, and public transit. So it's very important that the mobility ecosystem understand the political environment they're operating in, and mainly they're operating in cities. And if they're operating in European cities, they are wanting to reduce car ownership. So, what I find really interesting is companies that are responding to the politics of the day, because those policymakers set the trend. It's pointless to say, well, I'm operating in a vacuum. I don't need to worry about a Parisian or a Londoner. You do, unfortunately, because they're living and trying to drive your vehicle in that city. So, we've got a client like Elmo, which is quite interesting. They are teleoperating company. So, for a car share, instead of you having to go find the car, they can drive the car to you remotely. They have a teleoperator sitting in an office somewhere, and they drive the car to you, and you jump outside, and your cars are waiting for you. What that does is it reduces the friction of car sharing, makes it much more practical, thereby making car ownership less practical by comparison, because, with your own car, you have to go to the parking lot. Now this thing's waiting for you out the front door. And that's obviously very nice. So, what you start seeing a bunch of different companies starting to offer very good alternatives to car ownership. And in Europe particularly, we're seeing car ownership reducing. We're seeing car mileage reducing. We're seeing the average age of a new car buyer increasing. So basically, young people do not want cars as much as their parents' generation.
Yeah, very interesting. So now I'm very conscious of time because you're a busy man at Autonomy. So I want, though, to give you time, an open floor, as I like to say, in case there's a topic that you feel very passionate about, that you really want people to know about. Would you like that open floor?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting is, there's so many different ways to measure the results of mobility. So, today we're talking about, what the carbon emissions are or the pollution levels, and we can say, look, going from motorist to mobilist will reduce carbon emissions, and therefore that's a positive. I think it's also really interesting to look at it from the consumer side. So, for example, Elon Musk gave his recent big Tesla meeting, and it was all about the future of electric vehicles and renewable energy. And a lot of people will say, wow, this is great, we've now got a sustainable future. But there was very little criticism of it. And what people misunderstand is that future that he paints, which everybody owning an electric car, means that everybody who has to go to a restaurant has to find a parking bay. And you just start losing this connective tissue of cities that make cities work. So it's not a very sustainable future. It's actually an extremely unsustainable future done by electric vehicles. Electric vehicles need a huge concrete and steel infrastructure to park and drive and house these vehicles. So how do you get away to a much lighter infrastructure, considering that many people are becoming urban? Many cities still need to be built. If you have to build those cities for electric car ownership, you're just going to have a massive carbon footprint coming from the construction costs because you need so much steel and concrete. So we mustn't see a motor car as a solution. We mustn't see an EV as a solution. An EV is a tool, and the solution is really the mobility ecosystem that we need. And an EV should be a vehicle of last resort. In other words, if I'm traveling with my family, an EV is great. If I'm going, to a meeting that's, 2 kilometers away, the last thing I need to do is to drive an EV to that meeting. So I think we often get, stuck with this idea of a kind of clean energy utopia that is extremely resource intensive. It's kind of Musk ideology. We fix cars with electric vehicles, and then we fix planes, and then we fix, rockets. And this is complete madness. What you need to do is you need to try and say, how do we build cities that are places that are, fun to live, exciting, have space, can, bring creative, clever people. And that's not this ideology of everybody owning a car and having this incredibly spread out city, because cars take up so much space. You can't bring people together because you're always stuck in parking bays. So that would be the one point. The other point is that when you have the right mobility, you actually start getting healthier people. So America is the only developed country whose life expectancy has gone down. It's now like at 70, 78, 79. A combination of three things: opiate addiction, obesity, and COVID. If you look at European life expectancy, it's 3 or 4 years more. A lot of the reason for that is people walk more. So, America is this very sick society, largely because of its mobility patterns, which is car ownership and car use. If you could change Americans to move around like Parisians or Londoners, they would gain 3 years life expectancy. That's absolutely extraordinary. A study was done in Holland that people who cycle to work have 1.3 days per year less sick, 1.3 less sick days per year. So Americans worry about how do we reduce the amount of time we waste in traffic. Okay, well, we need, autonomous vehicles or this or that. In actual fact, they could get much more productivity in work days by just having more people cycling to work. So we have to look at these things holistically, and we don't. And we often get hijacked by, technical geniuses like Musk or business geniuses like Musk who sort of paint this, amazing future, which is not an amazing future. So I think you have to kind of go back to basics and say, how do you build healthy societies? How do you build healthy cities? How do you get humans to interact closely? Because that's where the magic happens. And not have everybody living in big homes with solar power, driving big cars into big parking lots. That's not a sustainable future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Now we get to our main segment, and this is a segment that we change it up in every interview. And this one I chose for you is called Flip the Script.
Flip the script. You are the one asking the questions, and I'll be the one answering them.
So, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Where are you based?
I'm based in Stuttgart, Germany.
Stuttgart. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I would like to. I mean, as somebody living in Germany, do you want to buy a car or not? Would be my first question, and the reason would be why.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, especially because it's the automobile capital of Germany, really one of them. But so when I was living out in the village, so for a long time I was living out in the village. Now I'm living more so in the city. But when I was living out in the village, I found it very hard not to have a car.
It is very hard.
Yeah, it was. So then, yes, I owned a car. I did buy a Twizy, if you know one of those. So a very small, not ideal in the winter, but worked really well in other times. And then when I'm in the city, though, I don't want to drive in a city. I find it horrible. I hate the stress of driving in a city. I hate trying to find parking. So there's no way when I'm in a city that I want to own a car at all. I know people that do because it's a they're given one maybe by their business that they work for, by their company. But in general, yeah, I don't want to own one when I'm in the city, but when I'm outside the city, yes, honestly.
Yeah, I love motor cars, and I go on holiday with my family and always rent a motor car, and I love it for that time because I'm a family of four, and if 4 people fit in a car really well.
Yeah.
So I think cars have a big place to play in the mobility mix, but car ownership used to be something when I was young that gave you status. It no longer does. It just feels kind of feels
trivial
yeah.
a bit. Yeah, I agree. Good. Yeah, thanks for the great question. It's perfect in the context of where I'm living at the moment. I'm originally actually from the US as well, so from Colorado, and so I'm also very accustomed to these challenges that you were speaking about in the US. So,
and what do you? Why are American cities unable to become, more like European cities?
Culture and infrastructure. I would say. I mean, the infrastructure is not there. We have very poor public transportation systems in general. And it's also a cultural thing. A lot of my friends say, oh, why would I take the bus when I can drive? It's not really something that's integrated into the culture and learning. Also education about these topics, I think, is quite poor. And yeah, when every one of your friends has a car, you're going to also get a car. So I think culture and infrastructure.
Yeah, it's the same as South Africa. If you don't have a car, you don't move.
Yeah, exactly. It's very challenging to get places in the US without a car. I mean, it's possible in a lot of ways. It depends on where you are, but you look at a massive city like LA.
No, it's impossible. Yeah.
It's impossible, but it's a massive city. They should have the infrastructure built in, right? But if you want to get from one place to another place in LA, you have to transfer like 3 times. It's not doable, really, unless you're really forced to. No one chooses that.
I spent a month in LA, and I spent 20% of my day in a motor car sitting in traffic.
Yeah.
Listening to,
not ideal.
Listening to NPR. Yeah. It's just,
hopefully you have time to listen to podcasts, though, or something like that. So, yes. So now we're on to our very, very last question. It's a question that we ask every single guest. And it's, to you, what is a smart city?
I don't think a smart city is a connected city. I mean, obviously all cities will be connected. and that's that's inevitable. I think a smart city is a city that's able to attract a lot of talent. What we're seeing now is that cities are competing for talent, because what talent does is talent attracts capital, and talent creates job opportunities for other talent to come. And when you see a city like Berlin or Paris or London, you just see this abundance of talent, money coming in, ideas becoming businesses, other people getting jobs, a lot of them leaving to start their own business. And you're just getting this kind of roll-on effect, this sort of snowball effect. And that's really what a smart city is. It's a city that has the ability to attract the talent. And there's not a lot of talent in the world, and there's not a lot of money in the world. And so it's highly, highly competitive. And that's really, what happens with cities. We work with London and Partners, with Choose Paris Region, with Berlin and Partners, with all these city agencies, and they all, have the same objective: is how do we get the best entrepreneurs, the best venture capitalists to our city as opposed to the next door city. And if you attract talent, you are able to figure out the problems of the day and, figure out the opportunities of the day. And that's going to be the big race, is to attract the best talent from the world. Unfortunately, a lot has gone to America and San Francisco. And I think Europe in the last 5-6 years has done quite well in pulling a lot of talent back to Berlin, Paris, London. But they need to keep going. And you see cities like Talent, just an extraordinary amount of talent. I mean, at Autonomy today, you have 6-7 companies from Talent. You have Bolt, you have Elmo, you have Ligu, all disruptive, Basetrack, all disruptive, highly, highly clever tech companies. Talent is a small city, but it's able to really attract and nurture talent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've actually had Copenhagen Capacity on the podcast as well. We work quite closely with them, and they're another one of those agencies that works to attract talent. So these business development agencies do incredible work actually as part of the city ecosystem. So, and also really interesting answer, because I've never had anyone answer that like that before. And that's what I love about this question, because everyone answers something different. So that's a really unique perspective. So thank you. And with that, I just have to thank you for your time. I know it's quite busy running around here. It's been a wonderful event so far. I've really enjoyed this first day. So we're sitting at the very end of the first day, and I'm looking forward to the second day. And so thanks for bringing us all together, and thanks for this really insightful conversation.
Thank you, Tamlin.
And I hope you don't have too many crises to work out.
No, that's all going well.
Okay, good. Good. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And to all of our listeners, don't forget you can always create a free account on babel-smartcities.eu to find out more about smart city projects, solutions, implementations, all these cool things happening. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you all for listening. I'll see you at the next stop on the journey to a better urban life.